But first to Labor's humiliation in the New South Wales by-election on the weekend in the Upper Hunter. Just 21% of the vote it got. Smashed by the Nationals in an election dominated by talk of coal. Now it turns out, big surprise, that workers just didn't want a bar of Labor of what was once the Workers' Party. So when will Labor finally get the message? It's jobs. Fight for jobs. Fight for the workers. Drop this obsession with victim politics, and especially with the global warming religion of the elites. Now, you would have thought that Labor would have learned that already, the hard way. It's already lost the 2013 federal election after breaking this promise in a fit of global warming madness.
There will be no carbon tax under the government I lead.
And it lost the last federal election after it refused to rule out banning the big Adani coal project in Queensland.
I'm a coal miner and a proud coal miner. Every time I open the newspaper or every time I turn the TV on, I see someone having a go at coal miners, and that has to stop. And I'm going to...
Wrong grab. I wanted to show you Bill Shorten saying no to the Adani coal mine. Now, to be fair, as you just saw, New South Wales Labor leader Jodi McKay realised that for this by-election you better fool the voters, particularly given that the Hunter Valley is a coal mining area. So it picked as its candidate that bloke saying he was a proud coal miner. But the feeble applause he got at the end for that punchline, proud coal miner, well, that tells a story, because Labor's candidate may be proud of coal mining for the coal that gives us 90% of our electricity, but the fact is that New South Wales Labor's actual policy, the one that it pushed at the last state election out in the open, calls for no more coal power, calls for as close as possible to 100% of our LNG coming from renewable resources instead by 2050. Voters are not idiots. They can work out that just because Labor runs a candidate in a coal area who's a coal miner, they can work out that that doesn't mean that back in the city, Labor stopped telling the inner urban elites that coal is bad and that we've got to stop even using so much gas. Think of the planet. Now, if the voters in the Upper Hunter hadn't already worked out that they were being conned, they would have been reminded last week by federal Labor, by late leader Anthony Albanese and his happy team of anti-coal people when they attacked the Morrison government's plans to build simply a gas-fired plant in the Hunter Valley.
This is a proposal which Mr Morrison and Mr Taylor must urgently release the business case for. If they're so confident that this stacks up, release the business case to the Australian people.
Now, really, what an idiotic message for federal Labor to send just days before an election when New South Wales Labor was desperate to seem like a friend of fossil fuels. Now, like I said, let's be fair to Jodi McKay, this New South Wales Labor leader, at least for the next few days. She did, for this election, pretend that Labor was all for coal mines. And that left, there was, against coal mines were the Greens, okay? They were arguing against them. And so did an independent, Kirsty McConnell, who was backed and partly funded by bitter Malcolm Turnbull, the former Liberal Prime Minister, now a global warming extremist out to destroy the Liberals. But get this, more than 80% of voters at this by-election voted instead for parties that supported coal mining. Turnbull's independent, she came 5th. The Greens came 6th. Well beaten by One Nation, both of them. And now Labor MP Joel Fitzgibbon, a former Labor minister, he's threatening to walk away from politics if Labor does not smarten up, represent workers, not elitists.
It's very clear that Labor is a long way from winning any election. I will say this, I won't stick around if the Labor Party doesn't wake up to itself.
Now, funnily enough, Prime Minister Scott Morrison sounded Labor a very similar warning in an interview he did with the Australian newspaper, ran today, but actually He gave the interview before the results of this election came through. And he said that the Liberals will now go after traditional Labor voters. John Howard did much the same, the Howard Battlers, because the Liberals, he said, represented the values of such voters much better than did Labor itself, because Labor treated people for decades, he said, as victims and said that only government can help them. Well, unfortunately, that's only too right. And I speak as someone who worked a couple of times for Labor back when it did have an eye for the workers. Do you know that even today, Labor's first question to the Prime Minister in question time today, it wasn't, what about the workers? It was how Morrison had somehow offended a women's rights activist back on Australia Day. I'll tell you about that farce later in the show. I mean, wake up. Victim politics, the global warming bandwagon, for heaven's sake. I mean, that particularly. Labor lying to workers that if we, just smash our coal-fired electricity system, drive power prices through the roof, then we'll stop a global warming. All on our own, I guess. That they lie is a catastrophic threat. I mean, people are not stupid. They can see that the dams that global warming extremes like Tim Flannery said would empty have not. You mean look at Sydney's Warragamba Dam, 97% full. The crops that these extremists warned would shrink, in fact, last year was a record 1/4-hour wheat again. And on it goes. We've actually got fewer cyclones, not more. We've got 3 times more low-lying Pacific islands growing than are shrinking. Labor, why would you destroy people's jobs, destroy their cheap electricity, tell them all these lies to pretend to stop what isn't even a problem? Global warming may be the religion of the elites, but the price for those global warming schemes, that's paid mostly by the poor, the workers. They've figured that out. And now they are seeing straight through Labor. To discuss this, I was joined early by Sky News political editor Andrew Clennell. Andrew Clennell, thank you so much for joining me. What does this result mean, first of all, for New South Wales Labor leader Jodi McKay?
I think she's gone. I mean, they're trying to get her to go. It's all down to the party's General Secretary, Bob Namba, who has been described as missing in action occasionally in his time in the role, but essentially there'll be enough momentum to get her to stand down at some point in the next couple of weeks, I think. And then the problem comes because they can't settle on a candidate. There are certain people in the caucus who hate Chris Minns. He's the front runner, but Michael Daly thinks he can come back. I think that's a pretty far-fetched sort of idea after the disastrous election campaign he had in 2019, but we'll see. And then there's a couple other names that are being thrown about. So, look, I think she's a goner. Everyone says she's a goner. Could be proven wrong because they just can't get their act together. But you'd have to think after this loss, if you don't do something, you've got to try something, don't you?
Well, if you can only persuade 1 in 5 voters to vote for the Labor Party, then you're really pushing it uphill. What does this mean, though, for federal Labor?
Well, they've been busy spinning all day, haven't they, that it means nothing, but I think it means quite a lot. One of the reasons is the Hunter region. Scott Morrison's been to the seat of Patterson 5 times. That's where he wants 1 to 3 extra seats, and he needs extra seats because he might lose 1 in WA and he hasn't really got a majority, or if he has, it's like a majority of 1, Scott Morrison, with Craig Kelly's defection, although Hughes you'd expect to come back. But so, it's a numbers game. They're really important numbers up there. The by-election was in that area. Now, Labor's saying, well, we haven't won the seat for 100 years, but they got within 2.6% last time. They've copped a 4% swing against them. They've got a primary vote, as you say, 1 in 5. And in a by-election, as you know, Andrew, there is always a swing to the opposition generally. So people are saying, well, it's a pandemic effect, right? And incumbents win. And they're sort of using that as an argument that it won't hurt federal Labor. But doesn't that very argument hurt federal Labor? Because guess who the incumbent is? Scott Morrison. So I just think it's all bad news for Labor. And I think they should start looking at taking a few risks, at least putting some policies out there. Albanese seems to be campaigning as if he just wants to get close enough to Morrison that he can fall over the line or have an honourable defeat or whatever. But I think an opposition should stand for a few things. They don't have to put all the policy out there, but they should stand for a few more things. And you can say we haven't put things out because of the pandemic. Well, goodness me, we're going to have the pandemic for 5 years, so may as well start now.
Well, do you expect any change in policies from federal Labor on global warming in particular?
No, I do not, because the left is so dominant in the Labor Party at the moment. So, look, their language, even Richard Marles on with us on Sunday Agenda, was a bit more trying to support coal workers. They'll use the language, but there'll be a target for Scott Morrison there. But Scott Morrison has his own difficulty, Andrew, and that's the pressure from the UK and US on net zero emissions. He's going to commit to that target before the end of the year, Scott Morrison. So can he really argue that he's all about coal and gas and Labor aren't when he's heading down a similar track? That's going to be fascinating to watch that unfold. Labor's having its problems with its splits at the moment, Joel Fitzgibbon versus Chris Bowen and all the rest. But what about the Nats versus Scott Morrison later in the year?
But what you mentioned, Joel Fitzgibbon, he today threatened that he could walk away if Labor didn't wake up to itself. He didn't specify exactly what waking up to itself would look like. But how serious is this threat?
Well, Albanese thinks Fitzgibbon's planning to retire anyway. I can tell you that. So he thinks it's kind of an empty threat. Fitzgibbon, I think he doesn't know if he's running or not. And I think, amongst other policies, the tax cuts would weigh on him. What they do on the stage 3 tax cuts. He's about aspiration. This is kind of his moment in the sun, really. I know he's been a cabinet minister before, but last year or two, has he ever got so much attention or publicity, Joel Fitzgibbon? Has he ever had such a convincing message? So I think, frankly, he's enjoying himself and he thinks he's got a point. And Mark Latham, his old mate, and they've been enemies for years, would agree with him on needing to get those blue-collar votes back. And above all else, after the weekend, I think Joel Fitzgibbon can say, look, I'm partially vindicated here, with many sort of contesting that in the Labor Party up until Saturday.
Absolutely, with Mark Latham having moved up to Newcastle and also with One Nation having done very well, I wouldn't rule out Mark Latham standing for for One Nation or as an independent in that area come the federal election. One more headache for Labor. I think he could take a seat quite easily, I would imagine. We'll see. Andrew Clennell, thank you so much indeed for your time.
Thanks, Andrew.